From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and concerned citizens making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melathopoulos, Assistant Professor in Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. As many of you know from listening to the podcast, Oregon has some really remarkable, biodiverse, rich parts of the state when it comes to pollinators. Trouble is, some of these areas are not that well known. They're not marked. They're not on the main highway. They're a little difficult to find. And so I've welcomed back onto the show August Jackson. Now, if you remember from a previous episode, August is a interpretation coordinator at the Mount Pisgah Arboretum in Eugene, Oregon. He's also instructor for the Master Melitologist program here. He is an avid photographer of native bees. He knows his native plants. He also has a really wonderful book that he self-published on the bees of the Willamette Valley. So I thought from our last episode, one of the jewels that he outlined was the Steens Mountains. So in this episode, we're going to hear a little bit about where the Steens Mountains are located, what makes them such a wonderful place for bee biodiversity, and some of the bees that you'll encounter if you make your way out to the Steens. I'm also so thrilled to announce I'm mailing out 2 packages this week to 2 of our listeners, Mark Novinger in Middleton, Wisconsin, and Laura Oldenkamp in Canby, Oregon. Thanks for filling out the Pollination Podcast survey. And you, other listeners, can also get one of these packages, which includes Oregon Bee Project Ball Cap, one of our bee guides, a lot of the material we produce here in Oregon, just by filling out the survey. Just go to our website at pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu and fill out the survey, and you will enter in to win one of these wonderful packages from the Oregon Bee Project. Thanks for listening, and without further ado, here's August Jackson on the Steens Mountains this week on Pollination. Okay, we are here with August Jackson. Welcome back to Pollination.
Thanks for having me back.
Well, it's a real pleasure. Everybody loves hearing from you. And I guess, in the last episode we did with you, you gave us a whirlwind tour of some of the wonderful places for bees in Oregon. And I keep hearing people who are in the Master Melitologist program, and also other people who are trying to get a handle on the bees of Oregon, always point to this funny mountain range in the southeast corner, the Steens. So tell us a little bit about these mountain ranges. What do they look like? If you were driving towards that area, like what's it?
Yeah, it's actually a really interesting experience to drive out there because the Steens Mountain is just this fault block mountain that's really kind of characteristic of a lot of the Great Basin once you move into southeastern Oregon and then further south and east into Nevada and Idaho. But this is just this massive fault block that is about 50 miles long, and it rises to a height of about a full mile above the valley floor on the east side. So
when you say fault block, this means like the Earth just kind of like somehow in this whole.
You have both rising and then dropping on the other side. So on the western side, it's this super gradual rise, and it doesn't look like there's a mountain there at all. You can just kind of see a bit of a cliff in the distance, and if you're driving up it, and you can drive to the top of this mountain. That's the other thing that's pretty remarkable about it. So the summit is at almost 10,000 feet.
Wow.
So you're starting, down around Burns as you're approaching it at around, I believe it's around 4,500 feet. And it's such a gradual rise, you don't really even realize you're on a mountain until all of a sudden you've reached a point at which you're peering down into these glacially carved valleys and you realize you've come up about a mile. And then it drops straight down about a mile on the other side into the Alvord Desert.
So is this, I'm used to the mountains on, further west where, you've got trees and then you sort of break out of the trees and you're sort of in the Alpine. Is it the same kind of thing out in the Steens?
Not exactly. I mean, there's some similarities still, but it's almost like you're just still in the high desert. So think of the Bend, Central Oregon area, where you've got a mix of juniper, bunch grasses, and sagebrush, and you're just kind of climbing through that a little bit. Then you hit a band of aspen, particularly in the wet areas, and that continues up to 7,000 feet, 7,500 feet or so. But then after that, you just kind of reach this point where you're in a weird mix of still that kind of high desert sagebrush fauna, but it's a sagebrush subalpine area. And then that grades out to where you have no sagebrush and you're just in what some botanists have described as an alpine tundra at the top of Steens Mountain. And it's completely treeless. And all you have is bunch grasses and some really low, usually pretty scrubby wildflowers that can resist the really high winds that are often roaring across the summit.
And I guess on the other part of it is on the other side of it. There's like a salt desert. There's a
the Alvord Desert on the other side. So as the Steens lifted up, the basin below actually dropped down too. So you have this incredible desert that collects a bit of water in the winter and then dries out completely in the summer. And that's the Alvord Desert. And nothing grows in it centrally, but you have some growth along the sides. And I think some Bee Atlas volunteers have found some pretty interesting bees in the Alvord Desert.
Yeah, I think we had Link on a couple of weeks ago, and they found one of the alkali bees. There was a lone alkali bee caught out there, which is you can find them in managed areas and densities, but not sort of on their own. Okay, so tell us a little bit about the bees in this vast area. Is it kind of uniformly the same kind of bees, or does this gradient kind of lead to some little pockets and interesting things?
Well, there's just some incredible diversity on the mountain, and that's what makes it such a special place. And I think I kind of blew the secret there in the first year of the bee school, and that's why everybody started heading out that way. Thankfully, I can still find a spot to camp out there, but we've got a lot of people heading out there. The diversity is incredible, and the abundance too is incredible. Last year, my partner and I were out there, and we happened to hit it at a time where new Nevada bumblebee queens were coming out and foraging to get ready for overwintering. And there were probably 200 queens within about a quarter mile of road.
Is that right?
It's just incredible abundance on top of diversity. There are absolutely pockets where you'll find certain things, and there's so many specialist bees out there too, where you're going to find them on their host plants. Phacelia histata, some of the penstemons. You'll find some of the atoposmia. And then there's an endemic Steens Mountain thistle, Cirsium pecii, which only grows there and in a couple ranges nearby, that you'll find some, thistle specialists on as well. So the pockets are defined in part by the plants that are growing, but then I imagine, since it's such a vast space, that you're also going to have some pockets of bees hiding out in places that are kind of less accessible. If you go down into these glacially carved gorges, or go really, also at different times of the year, you're going to be exposed to a completely different fauna. And based on what I've found out there, we usually go about the same week every year, I find 100 plus species. So I estimate probably more than 300 species on that mountain, or
God,
maybe 300 to 400 if you include the Alvord Desert too. Just kind of an estimate based on what I found.
That is nuts. That's crazy. So this is this is one of the jewels for bee biodiversity in the state.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you get, deserts, as we know, are really excellent environments for bees. And so you get this desert that also then grades into an alpine tundra, and so you get a kind of diversity that you're not going to find elsewhere in the state, except, maybe places like Heart Mountain, and some others, out in the southeast Oregon, but pretty spectacular.
Okay, so tell us about your last few trips out there and what you were specifically looking for, and what did you find?
Yeah, I mean, not looking for anything exactly in particular. The bumblebee fauna out there is really impressive. So that's something that I'm always taking a close look at. Found about 15 species out there, which is, over half of what is in Oregon. So the bumblebees are really well represented, and there's some really interesting ones out there. So 2 years ago, I found a couple Queen Morrison bumblebees, and we know those to be pretty rare in Oregon, actually, somewhat rare maybe throughout their range. And the last time they had been recorded there was about 80 years ago. So It was nice to catch them again, kind of reconfirm their existence there. And then the same with the western bumblebee, Bombus occidentalis. The last time that had been recorded was 100 years ago. My partner Amy caught one on Steens mountain thistle, a male actually in July, and that was the first record in 100 years. And then she caught another one this year. She's always the one who catches these for some reason. She caught another one this year while we were out in a completely different place. So it seems like they're there on the mountain with, reasonable enough populations that you can see them in different places on the mountain at different times of the year. And so, possibly a reasonably healthy population. And then the other one that's fairly interesting is the yellow-faced bumblebee, which is, of course, our most common bee in Western Oregon and kind of up and down the West Coast. Just super abundant. The bee that at a certain point you tell people to stop catching. Mm-hmm. And it's not really recorded far east of the Cascades. But here's this disjunct population out on Steens Mountain. And actually, if you look in the excellent book, The Guide to North American Bumblebees, they don't have any records of that bee out there in that part of Oregon. So it's kind of been hiding out there, this disjunct population of a super common species, but really cool to see it out there. And out there, it's not super common. It's one of the ones you'll encounter less frequently. So that's neat. Always out there looking for bumblebees, and then just some of the specialist bees, specialists on Phacelia, because there's so much Phacelia out there. So you get a lot of interesting, you get Chelostoma Phacelii, which is this tiny little mason bee.
How tiny were we talking about?
Well, about 5 millimeters.
Whoa.
So very small, pollen specialist on Phacelia. You get some other small mason bees in the genus Ashmediella. Just some really, really neat species. And then a couple of my favorites are the two really bright metallic green Hoplites. So Hoplites fulgida and Hoplites lewisii are both found out there. And that's the only place in Oregon where I've encountered both of those together. And they're pretty rarely encountered, but they're just abundant out there.
It does sort of raise the question. We were talking about this before we started recording the show. With these Great Basin kind of mountain ranges, you were talking about the yellow-faced bumblebee being kind of a little, almost like a stranded population. Mm-hmm. It is kind of curious how these bees get there, and I guess once they're there, there's enough forage to really kind of allow them to have healthy populations and grow.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it's hard to know when these species first arrived and how it happened, but part of what's so great for bees about Steens Mountain is that you have a really incredible flora there, and you have an interesting mix of Rocky Mountain flora and Sierra Nevada flora converging, mixed in with some of our, of course, just regular Oregon and Cascades flora converging on this mountain, just based on its locality. So you also get some of those same bees that you tend to find more in the Great Basin or a little further east. So just really interesting combinations, and it may have been sort of refugia for these bee species when the climate shifted. And they are doing, fantastically up there. Again, the abundance is just extraordinary.
So, and I know there's always a temptation of evolutionary storytelling, but it could be something along the lines that they may have been down on the floor with some climate shifting and changing. They could sort of like whatever that fauna was on the floor sort of thinned out, and it really exists on the mountain or something.
Right, and there had to be some of that at some point because it was so heavily glaciated too. Steens Mountain, and it's always surprising when you're going into the desert in Eastern Oregon, and there's still snow on these mountains in late July, and there's just evidence of some pretty incredible glaciation with these classic U-shaped valleys that are 1,000 to 1,500 feet deep, and just a gorgeous landscape too.
So tell us a little bit about when's the best times to go there when you see like a lot of wildflowers. Is there multiple times because of that altitude gradient?
Yeah, there are multiple times of year because of the altitude gradient. So it really begins probably around June, really late May or early June at some of the lower elevations. Because again, we have to remember we're still at the bottom at around 4,500 feet. So spring comes late. And then it progresses super rapidly because it heats up there really fast. So from June through, late July is probably really the peak in a lot of the areas. And then, of course, you get some of your later summer bees, too, that are found throughout the state, and those will be coming on even later at those higher elevations. So through August. But from my experience, that peak diversity is really probably around July, mid-July, at least at those higher elevations, talking 7,000 feet and upward, where you're going to have a lot of wildflowers in bloom at the same time. And so you just have an explosion of life up there.
Wow. This sounds amazing. So I'm sure many of our listeners are wondering, and they're kind of opening up Google Maps and looking for this place. Like, how do you get to the Steens Mountains?
It's actually a really easy place to get to if you're willing to drive a lot. So unless you live close by, it's the far corner of Oregon. So from where I live in the Eugene area, it's about a 6-hour drive. But you can see the entirety of the mountain, well, the entirety of that elevational gradient, at least on the Steens Mountain Loop Road that takes you from the bottom to the top of the mountain and back down. And so you can really travel a lot of the ecosystem there without doing much hiking, which is excellent if you're trying to spend as much time as you can looking for bees and catching bees, and you don't have to worry about hiking 5 miles in to get to a good spot.
Fantastic. Well, let's take a quick break. I'm sure many of the listeners have the same questions in my mind. I want to hear more about some of the bees in the Steens, but also maybe some of the efforts that are going on to preserve the Steens so that this biodiversity is maintained into the future. So let's take a quick break, and we'll come back to both of those.
That sounds great.
Okay, we're back. So our tour of the Steens continues here with August Jackson. And at the break, you were telling us one of the other bee groups that are really remarkable out there, in addition to the bumblebees, are the bees in the family Megachilidae. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the bees that you would see in this family in the Steens Mountains?
Yeah, well, I think in some ways a little surprising that the Megachilidae would be so well represented on this mountain that doesn't have many trees.
Oh, right, because we think of them as stem nesters.
Yeah, you tend to think of them as cavity nesters, nesting in holes, beetle holes in dead wood or in twigs and all that. And so it's really fascinating, and I haven't, still figured out all of what's going on there. But, again, there are trees kind of climbing up. Aspen climbs up through some of these gorges. You have juniper lower down. Then you have sagebrush, which provides plenty of opportunities for stem nesting, for example. But then in that alpine tundra where things are just completely treeless, you have a ton of really interesting megacylids, including a lot of osmia, huge diversity of osmia species on the mountain. And then you have a lot of really fascinating hoplitis, as I mentioned. You have a ton of Anthidium species that are really interesting. So where are they all nesting? Well, part of the problem is that, a lot of these megachilid bees are characterized as cavity nesters, and that's largely true, but it's not always true. So there's a good diversity of nesting habits as well. But the other thing is, this is a really volcanic mountain with some really large volcanic boulders. And so what I've observed is there's a lot of nesting in those porous holes in volcanic rocks when the rocks cooled. So I don't know yet how many of these species are using the holes in the rocks, and if it includes a bunch of those that typically nest in wood or not. I would guess probably not, but it includes those that are known and willing to be a little more flexible.
Tell us a little bit about some of these genera, just some quick snippets on their life history for people who are new to these bees.
Yeah, so the osmia are the mason bees. So the ones that we tend to think of as using either leaf pulp or mud to seal off their nest entrances and to create the partitions in their nests. The osmia are pretty abundant in Oregon, and we have a pretty broad diversity. I think up on the mountain, and Joe Engler, who's another instructor with the Oregon Bee Atlas, has done a good amount of work in the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge and on Steens, and I think he recorded over 25 species or so, which comports well with what I've found, and I think there are probably more to be found on the mountain. So,
wow,
that's a big chunk of that fauna. And then you have some of the smaller ones, or usually smaller ones, like the hoplitis, and a lot of these are specialists. For example, myself and I think a couple other OBA volunteers have found Hoplitis plagiostoma on the mountain, which is a really interesting tiny little bee that is a specialist on forage family members, usually Cryptantha and Plagiobothris. And then you've got the Anthidiums, which are pretty interesting, kind of wildly colored bees that have a lot of waspish coloration on them, and some interesting species up there. It's the only place in Oregon I've found Anthidium formosum, which is a really, really large Anthidium, and pretty recognizable because the males have their penis valves so elongated that they're actually sticking out all the time, which is unusual for a bee.
I'd say. They're out in Eastern Oregon, they could do whatever they want, I guess.
That's right. Nobody's watching.
So this is the same genus that of the introduced European wool carder bee that people are familiar with.
That's right. Yeah. So same genus. We have several native species, and they're usually much better represented at kind of the in montane environments, the subalpine level, and even though they're not often kind of strict specialists, you tend to find them pretty readily around Phacelia. They're one of those that I like to think of as sort of preferentialists, where if you're looking for them, look on Phacelia.
There's places in Oregon I've gone where you find a few stems and it's kind of patchy. Are there does the Phacelia and the different I guess there's multiple species of Phacelia, does it come in fairly good chunks in the Steens?
Yeah, it does. Particularly Phacelia histata. It's a pretty disturbance-loving plant, so you actually tend to find it a lot just on the roadsides, and it grows really well along the roadsides. And then you have a much more attractive species Phacelia sericea, the silky Phacelia with these stalks of bright blue flowers, and that grows pretty well at the high elevations. But that one's a little less popular with a lot of the Phacelia specialists for whatever reason.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about, is there any protection of this area? It's such a wonderful place for bees and for plant biodiversity. Tell us a little bit about what you know about sort of the attempts to preserve it.
Yes, it's an interesting story. It was considered as being declared a national monument, I believe back in the late 1990s or early 2000s. And there was some resistance to that. And so the compromise was to come up with a Steens Mountain Advisory Committee, which consists of diverse interests, both ranchers with in-holdings on the mountain, the native tribes, so the Burns Paiute, and then various types of users and environmental groups. And the idea is that they'll work together to kind of manage this mountain. So parts of it are wilderness, and then parts of it are still private property, still ranched. And, this kind of cooperative management has been met with a lot of challenges, a lot of successes as well. But I think above and beyond, it has worked to preserve up to this point a really spectacular landscape that's not just spectacular in that part of the state, but is, in my opinion, one of the most beautiful places I've ever been.
Well, thank you so much for taking us on this virtual road trip of the Steens Mountains, and we'll have to get you on again to give us another tour of one of the other jewels of pollinator biodiversity in the state. And thank you so much for all that you do as an instructor of the Master Melitologist, and you've been training people right across the state on bee biodiversity and really making it accessible to regular people. So thank you so much for being on the episode, and thanks for everything that you do, August.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. The show is produced by Quinn Sin and Neal, who's a student here at OSU in the New Media Communications program, and the show wouldn't even be possible without the support of the Oregon Legislature, the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, and Western SARE. Show notes with links mentioned on each episode are available on the website, which is at pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's several ways to connect with me. The first one is you can visit the website and leave an episode-specific comment. You can suggest a future guest or topic, or ask a question that could be featured in a future episode. But you can do the same things on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook by visiting the Oregon Bee Project. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next week.